When a man was raised out in the desert by a couple of violent, drunken parents who abandoned him, he began to grow very out of control and violent himself. After a life of getting nothing but one after another slap on the wrist for his numerous crimes, he began to grow more bold, leading him to do the unthinkable, many times. This is the story of a serial killer that I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of you out there have never even heard of. This is because while a lot of his crimes are known, they either aren't known in very much detail or were only explained to close family members. Well, that's where this video comes in. After having interviews with and being presented with evidence from various close family members who wished to remain anonymous, we have the story of a previously unknown serial killer, Scott William Brodie. Barstow is a city in San Bernardino County, California, way out in the Mojave Desert. Being the desert that it is, it's a very hot, dry, desolate place. Temperatures in the summer can get as high as 120 degrees. The rocky hills are punctured with an unknown number of old mine shafts used back in the olden days. Only a little over 20,000 people live there, leaving plenty of long stretches of barren land between homes. Our story technically starts here way back in the 1940s, when a married couple named Earl and Blanche Brodie moved to Barstow from Texas. Earl worked for Santa Fe Railroad, giving him all sorts of manual labor to do in the hot desert sun. Using this money, Earl and Blanche began to build what would later become their family home together on 36231 Ramirez Road while they lived in a trailer nearby. It was hard work, with Earl and his friends using railroad ties from work to build the adobe walls of the home. But finally, their house was finished. Both of them were very proud of what they had built for themselves. Here is where they would spend the rest of their lives and raise their kids. Earl and Blanche had a son named Bill. Bill went on to serve in the Vietnam War in the late 60s. After serving 4 years in the U.S. Army, he came back home in 1970. There he met a married woman almost 10 years his senior, Susie, at the home she shared with her husband and 4 kids. It wasn't long before they started having an affair. Bill got into a serious relationship with this married woman and decided to make a life with her. Susie, at age 31, had 4 children from 2 previous marriages. And while waiting for her divorce to finalize, the two got pregnant with a new child. Susie decided to leave her husband, and the two moved into a small duplex just a half-mile from Earl's home in Barstow. Finally, the divorce got all tied up and the two were able to be married. 2 days later, their son, Scott William Brodie, was born. Bill and Susie's marriage, like most relationships built upon infidelity as a foundation, was nothing but chaos from the very start. Drugs and alcohol played a pretty big part in their family dynamic, to say the least, and this often led to violence. Bill would beat his stepchildren with all manner of household objects, like belts, cords, breadboards, and even dog leashes. Susie was more or less the same to all of the kids, except for Scott. If she ever attempted to discipline Scott, Bill's only biological child, Bill would turn on her and beat her instead. The abuse wasn't purely beatings, it was sexual as well. One of the stepdaughters accused Bill of forcing himself upon her. This was made even worse when a friend of one of the daughters spent the night at their home and Bill did the same thing to her as well. Both of these girls were in their very early teens at the time. Over the course of the next 4 years, many of the stepchildren would opt to move out of Bill's home and go back to live with their fathers. Still, Scott was one of those that stayed behind with the couple. The marriage gradually came to crumble. Susie finally left Bill, taking Scott to live with Bill's parents, Earl and Blanche. Finally, she ended the marriage in full by divorcing Bill. Susie gradually came to feel that Scott would be much better off being raised by his grandparents. After all, they were very respected within their small community. They were serious about their faith and their church, attending the First Baptist Church of Barstow. They were always doting on Scott, being the good influence he really needed in his life. For a while, though, Scott lived with Susie along with his sister for a couple of years. It was becoming more and more clear that Scott had some serious emotional problems. He was often fighting at school, having violent outbursts, and on occasion had even killed some of his neighbors' pets. He was showing all the signs of a budding serial killer, but at the time, people weren't so well versed in the subject. When Scott was 5 years old, he was playing with one of his friends when he hit him in the eye with a tree branch. While Scott claimed that it was only an accident, his young friend said that it was anything but. It wasn't too long after this that Susie decided to actually give Scott to his grandparents to live with them permanently. Not only would they be a better influence, but Scott would be able to see his dad more often as well. Susie then took her leave, virtually abandoning her son from that point onward. He would only hear from her very rarely from that point going on, but he continued to idolize her. In her absence, he built up this image of a loving and caring mother within his mind, speaking of her more highly than anyone. Meanwhile, Bill, struggling with his own issues, would move in and out of his parents' home many times over the years. Sometimes he would dip without seeing Scott for months and months at a time. Scott struggled with his loneliness and had trouble making friends. He instead developed a close relationship with one of his older sisters, often calling her, visiting her, and sending her letters. All the while, he tried to cope with his life as his problems only grew worse. When Scott came into his teen years, he started venturing out more as teens do. Scott wasn't going out in the town or hanging out with his friends, though. He was getting into trouble. In his mid-teens, he was caught stealing a car. When the police came out to apprehend him, they found that he also had drugs on his possession. For this, he faced his first serious punishment, first being sent to juvenile hall and then into a reform program called Outward Bound. Afterwards, he was finally able to return home and finish his schooling, graduating from Central High School in Barstow at the age of 19. He continued to live in his grandparents' house for the majority of his life. Earl continued to work for the railroad company while he built an extra house on the property to use as a rental and earn some cash. Scott really loved that home and hoped that it could be his one day. Scott, moving past his fear of interaction with others to a degree, managed to get a girlfriend named Catherine. He treated her much in the same way that he saw his father treat his mother. Catherine grew to be terrified of him, saying that he was very violent with her. He also had some fetishes that really unnerved her, mainly consisting of bondage and masochism. She stayed with him only because she was too scared to leave. Eventually, Catherine was admitted into a hospital due to her deteriorating mental health. Scott took this opportunity to leave her himself, taking all of her belongings with him as he went. Scott then went on to meet another woman named Carolyn in the early 1990s. They got married shortly after, having 2 kids named Haley and William. This was in addition to a daughter that Carolyn had from a previous relationship who was only 3 years old at the time. Again, Scott would behave much like his father in this relationship as well. One of the children in this home later confided to another family member, saying that Scott was just plain evil, adding, "He's a sadist." As it turns out, Scott had been beating them, sexually abusing at least one of them, and causing them to live in fear for years. Their mother knew about all of it the whole time and chose to do nothing. Carolyn's previous daughter was able to escape by making the choice to live with her father. She hoped that one day Scott would meet justice for the way he treated people. Scott began to take an interest in large-scale violence. In 1995, when the Oklahoma City bombing took place, Scott proclaimed his support for what Timothy McVeigh had done. When a family member told him that the building was full of innocent people, Scott said, "That was a government building. Everyone who works for the government is an enemy." When reminded that there was a daycare full of children in the building as well, Scott simply replied with, "Those people shouldn't have put their kids in a government daycare." Scott was told to get some mental help, given that most people wouldn't agree with mass murder. He simply responded with, "We're all crazy in this family," fully confident that his viewpoints were the norm. These viewpoints would lead him down a dark path where he would do the unthinkable over and over again. Scott's first major crime would come in the mid-1990s, and this was when he was accused of kidnapping, of all things, out in San Bernardino County. Scott was now on meth, quite a bit of the time, only adding to his delusions and violent fantasies. He had come to see his mother more often at this point in his life, sometimes staying over at her house for a few days at a time. One night, he was staying at her home when he decided to go on a good crank-field walk down Highland Boulevard. This was near to a place called Paris Hill Park, which was known for being an area in which a lot of more shady individuals would come to hang out at night. Across the street from this park was Security Pacific Bank, and outside was an ATM machine. Scott was walking past this very bank when he noticed a young man at the ATM withdrawing some cash. He decided that this was prime time to make some easy money and attack the young man. He took the keys to his car, his money, and restrained him. He threw the young victim into his own car and drove him out to a remote area in the desert. This is where he would come to rape that young man repeatedly in a meth-fueled frenzy. He threw the victim back into the car and continued driving north to Victorville. Given that Scott had already been awake for a good 2 days straight, he started nodding off as his high came down. He began to fall asleep while driving, causing him to veer off the road and crash into a small gas station. While he was in a daze, the young victim managed to escape from the car and call the police. They were on the scene in mere minutes, arresting Scott on a myriad of charges. Scott eventually went to trial for kidnapping, as the young victim was too ashamed to admit to the assaults at the time. Scott was sentenced to 15 years in prison. After Scott went to jail, his father, Bill, weaseled into his marital home and cozied up to his wife, Carolyn, and their 2 kids. Bill was known for chasing younger women and, sure enough, started a physical relationship with his daughter-in-law within only a few days after his son was incarcerated. The 2 came to do a whole lot of drugs together. They decided that they wanted to make their own, opting to start up a good old meth lab in the garage of Earl's home. Eventually, the lab came to blow up, catching the garage on fire. Bill and Carolyn ran out of the blazing home, leaving the 2 children inside to fend for themselves. Eventually, the fire was put out and the kids were saved, but Bill and Carolyn were sent to jail to rot away alongside Scott. Both Scott and Carolyn gave up their parental rights, and the kids went on to live with their maternal grandmother. Carolyn eventually got out of jail. While the courts had ordered her to have no more contact with the kids, she soon moved in with them and her mother. They all then moved out to Claremore, Oklahoma, and raised the kids there. Scott would only come to serve less than half of his sentence, and after getting out, he confided to a family member about the assault. He had to make it clear that he wasn't gay, he simply enjoyed the feeling of being dominant and in control of another person. He admitted that he liked to know that people were afraid of him, and this was when he also admitted that this incident was not his first rodeo. Scott would often go out to bars in San Bernardino, where he would meet various men, usually male prostitutes. He would then invite them over to do some drugs with him. When they were high as a kite, he'd restrain them much as he did the previous victim and take them out into the desert. There, he would force himself upon them over and over again until he grew tired of it. Then he would murder them and throw them into one of the many abandoned mine shafts in the area. He confessed that he had done this with up to 7 men, adding that nobody ever suspected him of anything, let alone questioned him. His ex-girlfriend, Catherine, came to admit that she knew about these crimes but was too afraid to say anything, meaning that he had been doing this habitually for years. As he confessed, his family wondered if it was only his drug-induced delirium talking, but they came to believe in these stories more and more as his path down a life of crime continued. Scott had learned a lot from the seasoned, older veteran criminals while in prison. He learned a lot about how to better commit and get away with his crimes. He took this information to heart, choosing not to change his ways, but instead to double down. It was now the early 2000s. Scott was out of prison, but he was far from out of the criminal world. In 2004, he was hit with a felony charge of receiving stolen property and vandalism. This was later changed to felony burglary, to which he pled guilty. For this, he was sentenced to 973 days in prison. Shortly after, he and Carolyn decided to divorce amicably. In 2006, he was again released from prison, free once again to continue his crime spree and tack on even more charges to that criminal record. This was when he came to be involved in a very bizarre situation. Scott went over to check on a friend who lived in a small home out in the desert. Getting no response when he knocked on the door, he went inside. This was when he saw that his friend was dead and had been dead for probably weeks. This was out in the hot desert, no less. Needless to say, the body wasn't in very good shape. Nevertheless, Scott decided to live in that home with the corpse for a good week or 2. When he left, he chose to steal his friend's shotgun, despite being a felon, along with his checkbook and various other items. When the police pulled him over, they saw Scott there with the stolen items and came to the quick assumption that he had probably killed his friend. He was charged with felony assault with a deadly weapon, not firearm or force. When it was later found that the man likely had died of natural causes, the charges changed. Now he was charged with receiving stolen property over $400 and fell in possession of a firearm. He pled not guilty, and somehow he got away with it, with the charges being dismissed later in the month. It was now 2010. Scott really wanted his grandparents' home to be his own. However, there was one problem. His father, Bill, was obviously going to be the next of kin and would inherit the home. That meant he would have to wait on Bill to die as well before the property could finally be his. He thought that he would be better off speeding up the process. Bill had gotten cancer in his jaw. He was told that he only had 1 year to live. But it didn't end up even being that long. He took too much of his prescription medication, overdosing and losing his life. Only a few months later, Earl had the very same fate when he overdosed on his own prescription medication as well. Scott later admitted to his family that, unsurprisingly, he had been the one to give each of them too much of their medication. He would then purposefully wait a few hours for them to die before calling 911. Given that Bill was already dying of cancer and that Earl was in his mid-90s, the authorities never found either of these deaths particularly suspicious. After all, both of them were as good as on death's door already. No investigation was ever even performed. Scott got what he wanted. His dad and his grandfather were now out of the picture, leaving the house to go to him. He also got quite a bit of land, a motorcycle, and a pretty good chunk of savings from Earl. He was now finally free, out of jail, living large on his own property. For a while, most of Scott's crimes would mainly consist of traffic violations. Mainly speeding. He did a lot of speeding. After a while, he decided he no longer wanted any more tickets, so he chose to run from the police instead of being pulled over. He was caught and charged with evading peace officer with wanton disregard for safety. He pled guilty to the charge and was sent back to county jail for a while. When Scott was released in 2013, he went right back to what was now his home. Surprisingly, his son, William, came back into his life when he turned 18 years old. He chose to live with his father in his home for a while. One afternoon, the father and son were doing some drugs together when Scott confessed how Bill and Earl had actually died, saying, "He was old. It was better that way." William was so blown away that he didn't even know how to respond. After a long, awkward silence, he asked his father how he could do that. The response was, "I was tired of waiting for my money. They were both dying anyway." It was only 1 week later when Scott attacked his son, accusing him of, quote, trying to get with his woman. He beat William so badly that his entire face was left black and blue. William had seen enough of his father's true colors and decided to leave the home, never coming back. Shortly after, his mother Carolyn passed away as well, leaving him basically orphaned. Scott came to confess his most recent murders to his daughter and other family members as well, but none of them had any proof. The bodies had long since been cremated, and it had been years since the murders had taken place. As a result, there wasn't really anything to be done. It seemed that, for the time being, Scott was simply just going to get away with it. Scott started renting out the extra rental property that Earl had built on his land. He got into an argument with some of the tenants and ended up taking them to court after he ordered them to vacate and they refused. This time he was actually trying to use the law to his advantage, surely an odd feeling for good old Scott. The courts ruled in his favor and the tenants were forced to vacate. It wasn't long before Scott was back on the other side of the law, though. In 2016, he was arrested once again for being under the influence of a controlled substance. He pled not guilty, and luckily for him, the case was dismissed. Only 3 months later, he was arrested once again, this time for being a felon in possession of a firearm, and once again, for reasons unknown, the case was completely dismissed. It's very likely that, after his recent court victory and having one case dismissed after another, Scott came to feel powerful, like he was above the law. This was when Scott came to be involved in a much bigger case. He was finally about to be charged for one of his murders for the first time. One night, the police in Barstow were called out to Scott's home on the 36000 block of Ramirez Road. This is where a man named Robert Whitnack was lying on the ground with trauma to his upper body. It became clear that he was suffering from a gunshot wound to the chest. He was swiftly taken away to the Barstow Community Hospital. The doctors came out to save him in any way that they could, but they shortly realized that it was far too late. Robert was pronounced dead then and there in the emergency room. Truth is, Robert wasn't the best guy out there himself. He had actually only been released from jail earlier that day and had quite the lengthy criminal record. He had charges ranging from kidnapping to grand theft to robbery. The detectives came to put forth a press release saying that the two criminals, Scott and Robert, had been involved in a verbal dispute inside a building on the property. This is where Scott shot Robert and left him to die in the street. Scott had fled the scene immediately after, but the police were able to track him down and take him into custody without much incident. Scott was booked into the Barstow jail and hit with a $1 million bail, given his extensive criminal record and this being a murder charge. However, much to the surprise of everyone following this case, 2 days later, Scott was anticlimactically released from prison with no charges. Even news media outlets expressed their confusion at this sudden turn of events. The public was left not knowing what had happened, only being told that the district attorney's office had rejected the case. That's all they were left with. To his family, Scott told the real story. He really had learned a lot from the veteran criminals in prison, and this time he decided to plan out his crimes meticulously. It seems that he had beef with Robert for some time over both drugs and money. He wanted his revenge, so he formulated a plan to get it. While Robert was in jail, Scott stole his bike and took it back to his home. He told a mutual friend that Robert could come get the bike whenever he got out of jail, saying that he wouldn't be home, but Robert was free to come inside and grab it. Scott then kicked out the screen door in front of his home and sat back in the dark, waiting for Robert to show up. When he did, Scott shot him right in the chest, then and there. Scott told the police that he was the victim of a violent home invasion, with Robert having kicked in his door while he was at home, leaving him with no choice but to defend himself. His plan worked, and the police believed him. After all, Robert had just gotten out of jail and was no stranger to crimes like this. The evidence also appeared to show signs of a breaking and entering having taken place. So they dropped the case entirely. Scott was free once again, this time without even receiving a charge. Adding to his high, he was soon arrested on charges of possessing a firearm and transporting a controlled substance, and yet again, both of these cases were dismissed. He really felt that he would get away with anything at this point. After all, he had been doing so for quite some time now. Everything from speeding to full-on murder. Scott went back to his home to live his life. Working on bikes during the day and getting high and exploring the desert at night, he was really enjoying himself. He could live the secluded life out in the barren wasteland that he enjoyed, all while getting away with any crime he pleased. Scott was once again renting out the extra home on his property in 2017, this time to a woman in her 30s. This woman was dating a man named Archie Stewart. While it hasn't really come up until this point, Scott was a raging racist. He couldn't stand black people. And, well, Archie was black. Scott told the tenant, "I don't want this N-bomb on my property." However, free to date whoever she pleased, she continued to bring Archie around. Scott wasn't going to have it. Having just recently gotten away with murder a year before, he decided that he'd find a way to do it again. He came out of his home and boldly shot Archie in the chest, leaving him to collapse on the ground. He went back inside, waited for about 20 minutes, and came back outside to shoot him once more in the shoulder. He then went back into his home once more, waited another 20 minutes, and came out one more time. Somehow, Archie was still alive, so Scott shot him once more in the head. He then went on to bury him out on the property. The female tenant, discovering this, called the police. It wasn't long before a search warrant was issued and the cops came out to check on the property. They brought one of their best search dogs to come sniff around. It wasn't too long before she pinged a certain spot out in the yard. The police began an excavation and soon found Archie's body buried in a shallow grave. They took his fingerprints to confirm his identity. Scott was once again taken into the High Desert Detention Center on a charge of murder, this time to be held without bond. He was then charged with use of a firearm to cause great bodily harm and murder in the second degree. He was going to be stuck in jail for quite a long time. This time, Scott had no excuse. He couldn't really think of a way to weasel out of this one. He was left with no choice but to battle the legal system the old-fashioned way. So he pled not guilty to all charges in relation to the murder. Somehow, though, he was able to get his hands on some drugs in jail. So on a much more minor note, he was charged with possession of a controlled substance while in jail, and for that he was sentenced to 20 days. Scott's new strategy would be to delay the trial for as long as he possibly could. He said that this was the best way to go about it, believing that if the trial went on long enough, witnesses could die, forget important details, or simply move on with their lives and leave it all behind them. While waiting in jail, Scott decided that he would try to get ahead of the game and look for some women on the outside. He set up a dating profile on one of those sites geared towards helping incarcerated criminals find love. Using some comically very old pictures of himself to make himself look as good as he could, he told his side of the story. This was a very different story from what happened in reality, with him writing, "I've been in most of my life, 30 years out of 51. I owned 5 acres and 2 houses outside of Barstow, California, but was on meth. So tweakers and bullies tried to take over my place. In June 2016, a gang member came out and beat my maintenance man up, came in and pulled a knife/crowbar on me. I had to kill him out of self-defense. I was arrested and released 72 hours later. 11 months later, another bully beat me in the face with a steel pipe, bullied his way back on my property for 2 weeks, then picked up a hammer in an argument with a female friend of mine. So I went out with a gun to save her. He then ran towards me with the hammer raised and I shot him and killed him. But then I got scared and tried to hide it. Now I've been found guilty of second-degree murder and have some time to do. I'm not sentenced yet. I want you to write and talk on the phone. Some female companionship. We can keep each other smiling. I don't have any recent pictures, but will soon. I'm straight up and straight out honest, so ask anything." In 2020, to make the trial last even longer, Scott attempted to petition for his release. He knew that this wouldn't work, but it would definitely be a good way to stall. He said that he had pled not guilty and was being unlawfully detained. While this request was denied, it did manage to push things back. It wasn't until April of 2024 until the sentence finally came. For his charge of discharging a firearm causing great bodily harm, Scott was sentenced to 25 years to life in a state prison. For his charge of discharging a firearm, he was sentenced to the high end of the maximum sentence possible, being given another 15 years. And then, for being a felon and using a firearm, he was hit with another 10 years in prison. While he was given credit for the 5,454 days he had served, it didn't really matter. His final sentence came out to 55 years to life. Already being 52 years old himself, Scott won't be seeing the outside of a prison wall ever again. While he will never likely see justice for his numerous kidnappings, sexual assaults, and murders he admitted to committing in the past, he will regardlessly be locked up for the rest of his life, finally seeing some real justice for one of his many, many crimes among a sea of short sentences and dismissals. Now, his family is left to deal with the knowledge of what one of their own had been doing all this time, but also with the relief to know that he is finally where he belongs. Once again, thank you for watching my video. If you found it interesting, please give it a like, as it really helps me out in the algorithm, and hey, feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. In celebration of 500k and by popular demand, I have a merch store up now too as well. I only have a few designs up there right now, but I'm hoping to add more pretty soon. Just recently I've started up a podcast with 4 of my friends, and if you like this channel, I think you'll probably enjoy that as well. Go ahead and follow me on social media if you want. I mean, if anything were to ever happen to this channel again, that would probably be the only way you'd ever hear about it. I really appreciate when people follow me on Patreon. There you can get videos early, ad-free, and uncensored. Channel memberships are up too, and you can get the same benefits there as well. So, once again, this has been your host Kyle. Thank you, and good night.